I don't know why I did that, but you're good now.
It was there, you're good now. All right,
Yeah.
it was there, but when around the all right.
Oh, mercy.
Anybody need a copy of our outline this morning, text and manuscripts and New Testament?
I do see.
I thought I got the other one.
Yeah.
Good
morning, Jack.
Good morning to you. How are you doing?
Well, I'm making a little ahead of the pain better now because steroids they gave me for a week and things, just got the inflammation. I still got doctor's visits, MRI tomorrow. I think that's it.
Same thing as you.
Mean as ever.
Ron,
Push the T all the way forward and you're in full
Is
control.
that what that means?
gimme.
Do I need one of this?
Gimme.
I don't know you do or not. Did you get one last week?
Yeah.
Text and manuscripts and New Testament.
I got one.
Oh, I like it.
Thinking of you doing it.
Oh, I'm
I went count where it was at. A little bit better. Where things go.
Yeah. Boots, too, so let's get it.
I gotta lose some weight.
I'll work on that one. Okay.
First 30 years of my life, I was shredded about how skinny I was.
Yeah.
We had been studying text and manuscripts, the Old Testament, and our natural progression in our study of the words of the Bible. We're going to be looking at this morning text and manuscripts of the New Testament.
Get that on.
I need
thought
that.
did have it on.
I hate to tell
You do need one? All right. We can get you one without any problem. Maybe two there. Looks like there is. My fat fingers wouldn't separate them. There we go. Okay. Did you need one? All right. Well, let's begin a word of prayer here this morning. Most holy and divine Father in heaven, we're thankful to you for this Lord's Day and thankful for the time we had to be with fellow saints and thankful for the encouragement we derive from one of those studies of your word, and pray, Father, we might be edified by our continued studies of your will for our lives. We're thankful, Father, for the Holy Spirit's work in preserving your holy scriptures down through the ages, and thankful for the assurance that we have through the evidences that we have around about us, that we do have a good revelation of the things that you have for us to do in our earthly sojourn. We're thankful, Father, for the spiritual blessings we enjoy in Christ. We're thankful for the redemption that we have through Jesus' shed blood upon the cross, and thankful that this redemption provides for us the forgiveness of our sins as we continue to walk in the light of your truths, and pray to continue to forgive us as we continue to strive to live in accordance with your will. We're mindful, Father, of those of our number that are gone because of sickness and illnesses, and pray you to be with them and restore them to their much wanted health. Pray you watch over and care for their needs, and that the things being done in their cases might be successful. We're thankful, Father, for the many things that you blessed us with in this life, and pray you continue to bless us in your own wise way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, we're going to introduce what we're talking about here with respect to New Testament manuscripts. When John clicked that, he took it away. I had it, so let's get it back here. Maybe. No, that took it away. Okay. Now we're going. Things. Just like what we talked about in the Old Testament situation, there are no original manuscripts with respect to the New Testament, no autographs, in other words, those penned by the apostles, by the inspired writers of the first century. You perchance need a copy, you think, have it, all right? New Testament books were written in the latter half of the first century, from about 50 AD to 100 AD, but soon after the books were written, the original autographs perished. But what we emphasize is that God has preserved His Word through copies of the New Testament, and those copies are called manuscripts. But we're going to get to why this is not a problem, in fact, accounts for some extreme reliability of the New Testament scriptures that we have before us. Now, I think one thing to point out is that there is a unique difference between Old Testament and New Testament manuscript evidence. We talked about this in regard to the Old Testament manuscript evidence. The integrity and accuracy of the Old Testament text largely result of the extreme care taken by the copyist, in particular Jewish scholars, in the transmission process down through the ages. Though there are very few Old Testament manuscripts that are known, we know that they're of very high quality. The reliability of the New Testament, though, rests on a different basis, and that's on the vast multitude of existing manuscripts. And you have there on your outline what we mean by the large number of New Testament manuscripts. The number of New Testament manuscripts written in Greek between the 2nd and the 15th centuries that we currently know of is 5,686. And it's because of this vast number of manuscripts, the New Testament is the best attested book from the ancient world. And we'll talk more about that as we go through our studies. The time between the original writings to the earliest manuscripts is also important to note in this study. Remember again, we noted in our Old Testament studies of those manuscripts, there was some 1,300 years that stood between the date between the Old Testament, when the Old Testament books were written, which was the last one about 450 BC, and the time of the earliest dated manuscript. There was dated manuscripts clear down 916 AD. Now there's an exception, that is the find of the Dead Sea Scrolls that pointed that out, but for many, many centuries that's all they had to go by to study the integrity and reliability of the Old Testament scriptures. There was some 1,300 years difference between the time that they were originally written and the time that you have the first copies that we have there. For the New Testament, there's only 130 to 150 years that stands between the approximate end of the New Testament writings, which would be about 100 AD, and the date of the earliest New Testament manuscript copies, which is around 250 AD with the more recently discovered Chester Beatty manuscript, and we'll talk about that manuscript here in just a moment. And we'll also make note that there's one fragment that dates just 30 years after the New Testament book was originally written. So there's a big difference, you see, in the time frame with respect to when the original documents were written, even though they're not in existence, and the copies that we have that show up of the New Testament. There's not 1,000 years between them like it was with respect to the Old Testament. I also want to mention the common grouping of the manuscripts that are out there. Most manuscripts that we're going to be talking about do not contain the entire New Testament. There's just a handful that contain the entire New Testament, and Old Testament, there are a lot more of them that contain the whole Old Testament. Most of them, though, when you're talking about the New Testament manuscripts, since they were hand-produced copies, having the whole New Testament was just too bulky for practical use. So apparently it just wasn't done. At least we don't have any, don't have very many, what would comprise the entirety of the New Testament. So there's 4 categories that they found in these manuscripts that were generally followed when making copies of the New Testament. One category, the 4 Gospels. You have several manuscripts that have all the 4 Gospels, or most of the 4 Gospels on record. A second category is the Acts and the general epistles, like James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. So you find in these manuscripts this grouping of just those books that you have record of being copied. And then a third grouping is the Pauline epistles, all of Paul's writings. And then the fourth is the book of Revelation by itself. Just a, I guess you might say, a trivia thing about these manuscripts. They all fall into basically these four different groupings. Questions or comments that you have on what we've looked at so far here in an introductory comments? Another thing to make note of is the different types of manuscripts, and we'll have more to say about this too as we look at these manuscripts individually here. Made up of three major types. The first being papyrus. Many of the earliest witnesses to the New Testament were written on papyrus material, and it's almost certain that this was the material that the New Testament autographs were written on, because this was the most common writing material in what we call the New Testament times, the New Testament days of the apostles and the inspired writers writing. So there's a lot of these manuscripts that are written on papyrus. And we talked about writing materials some time back. You remember papyrus made out of the papyrus plant. And they would smash it up and put it together interwoven and make what we would refer to today as kind of the best quality handmade paper. So it was very equivalent to paper, although it wouldn't be thin like this, it'd be much thicker, but it was a common writing material in the first 3 centuries, this side of the cross. Another type of manuscript we're talking about are the uncials. The manuscripts of this group are among the earliest and most important, and we'll see that as we go through our studies, I think. Uncial manuscripts were written with all capital letters and no spaces between the letters. There are about 360 that we know of uncial manuscripts in existence at present. There are always archaeologists finding more as time goes on. So it kind of depends upon the time of history whenever you study this out as to how many manuscripts there are on record or in existence. But the best I can find right now is about 360 in this particular category. And I think we've alluded to this before. Some of the difficulty in the translators from these is, just like I said, all caps, no spaces between the letters. And I mean no spaces between the words either on things. So they'd have to look at these Greek letters and determine, well, here's where a word is and here's where a word, and so on and so forth. That counts for some minor errors. We'll talk about that when we get to textual criticism, another lesson. But just to point out the distinct difference in these uncial manuscripts and papyrus. And then the next one, minuscule manuscripts are also known as cursives. Minuscule script was a development of the cursive hand and differs from the uncials by its use of smaller forms of letters. And as I understand, a good bit of them do have separation of words and that type of thing, distinction in that. The small letters could be written more quickly and required less space than the all caps in the uncial manuscripts. Now, one thing to note, the minuscule didn't make their debut until about the 9th century, and so they're of less value because of their dates, but we'll make reference to them. At least they are out there, and they do have some value, at least in comparison processes of the older manuscripts and these later ones that came later in date to confirm if there was an error here, an error there, and determining what is the best situation to follow there. Questions or comments on this introduction here to New Testament manuscripts? Let's talk about manuscript evidence for superior New Testament reliability. You don't have it on the chart, haven't had it on the chart for some time, but you remember 1 Peter chapter 1, 22, 25, I read it last week. where the Apostle Peter affirms that the Word of God endures forever. And we believe that God has indeed taken the steps necessary, providentially at least, to preserve His Word from New Testament times down to the present age. Even though He didn't see a need to preserve the autographs, He has preserved His Word through these copies. And as I made mention last week or the week before, when I say we believe that, it's important for us to understand that our belief, our faith in this is not a blind faith. And that's the accusation that critics would say. Our faith is based upon evidence. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Faith is, from the biblical perspective, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We haven't seen this process of the New Testament autographs being copied properly and brought down to our age, but we have faith that's based upon solid evidence that God has indeed preserved His Word. And so that's what we're talking about here, looking at these evidences that are out there that gives us the assurance that our faith is not misdirected. Our faith is right on target in believing that we have a reliable transcription of God's will, even though we do not have the autograph of the New Testament revelations. Gene, do you have a question or comment?
The availability of the original manuscript historically tends to cause people to worship the manuscript rather than messages.
That's exactly right.
And you see the wisdom of God there,
That's right.
so that man doesn't go with paper,
Mm-hmm.
but with the message included.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a valid explanation as to why God chose not to preserve the original autographs written by the apostles. We kind of made mention of that last time with respect to the Old Testament manuscripts. Of course, that's one of the first things critics of the Bible say, well, why didn't God preserve those on things? Well, just point out the fact that it's a historical fact. And we even pointed out a biblical example of the children of Israel on one case wanting to worship that serpent on the pole. That was around for some 700 years, and so it had to be destroyed in Hezekiah's day on things. And we know in modern times people just seem to want to worship these things that come from supposed religious antiquity type of things. I mean, people, they think they've found splinters from the cross of either Christ or some martyr, and they worship those things, or linen cloths from martyrs, and they worship those things. And I think exactly is the case, like Gene is saying, if God had those original autographs, and we knew they were original autographs, more than likely they'd be worshipped rather than God Himself being worshipped. Things count. Question.
Same thing, we don't need an ark.
I'm sorry?
We don't need an ark.
Yeah, that's right on things. You know, there's a lot of, about the ark out there that they think they're supposedly finding on things. I question my studies of it, whether they're even on target at being their own thing, but don't need it on things. And that's one thing I wonder if it even is, because I don't know that God would even see a need to preserve it. In fact, would rather not preserve it, because if they do find it, and they're sure that's it, you can bet your bottom dollar people are going to be worshiping it and cutting off splinters of the wood and selling it for it and everything else, if it was on things. But that's all lens to this point we're talking about. Now, manuscript evidence there for superior New Testament reliability, important for us to talk about it, because the New Testament is constantly under attack, and its reliability and accuracy are often contested, especially by critics. But the main problem here is their refusal to honestly consider the evidence concerning the New Testament's reliability. And that's what we're talking about here, honestly considering the evidence that's there. And we start with this particular point here. If the critics want to disregard the New Testament, then they must also, if they're honest, they must also disregard other ancient writings by Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and I've got examples of this here, and we'll go through this here. And this simply because the New Testament documents are better preserved and more numerous than any other ancient writing, including these several that we're going to give you for examples of what we're talking about. So use this, again, if you're talking to somebody that's questioning the reliability of the New Testament scriptures in particular. Most people are aware of Plato, a Greek philosopher. He wrote several, they're called dialogues. He wrote them sometime between 427 and 347 BC. But we don't have any original autographs. Don't have any original documents written by Plato. What we have are copies, and the earliest copy is down 900 AD. The earliest copy of Plato's dialogues. There's some 1,200 years time span between the original that was written by Plato and the copies. Now you can ask these people, do they believe that these copies represent what Plato wrote? And most times they're going to say, yeah. They don't criticize those documents. They're not questioned by the same critics of the Bible, the writings of Plato. You come down to Julius Caesar. He is a noted author of Latin prose, and his writings date between 100 to 44 BC. But again, there's no original autographs written by Caesar out there. The earliest copy that we have of him is 900 AD, 1,000 years after he originally penned the words on things. Oh, and I failed to mention there's only 7 copies of Plato's works that we have on record. There's only 10 copies of the records of Caesar, Julius Caesar out there. Tacitus, he was a noted Roman senator, historian of the Roman Empire, and has extensive writings about the history of the Roman Empire, and wrote these about 100 AD. Again, no original autographs of what he wrote. All that we have in record, the earliest copy, 1100 AD. Time span from, I skipped down to Aristotle. 1,000 years time span between the original date of writing and the earliest copy, and you only have 10 copies of his writings of the history of the Roman Empire. Aristotle, again, most people know of Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, from 384 to 322 BC, and he has extensive writings. Again, we don't have, historians, bibliographers, they don't have any of his original writings, autographs, I'm saying. All they have is the earliest copies dated 1100 AD, which is 1,400 years time span between the time he originally wrote and the earliest copy that we have on record. And there's only 49 copies of Aristotle's works. Homer, some people may not be aware who Homer is, but he's most noted for a work, he was an ancient Greek poet, most noted for a work called the Iliad. The Iliad is a poem that tells of the battles and the events during several weeks of the Trojan War, the downfall of Troy, Achilles, all that. You're familiar with that. And that's enough to tell people who we're talking about Homer on things. Just this one document itself was written in 900 BC, but no original autograph of what he wrote. The earliest copy is 400 BC. So there's a 500-year time span between the time that he originally wrote it and no autograph copy, only the copy. Now there are 643 copies of the Iliad. He's got other writings out there, but just the Iliad itself we're talking about. And those that study the accuracy of these kind of documents give that particular work a 95% accuracy rating, just by the copy that is passed down through the ages. And you can see where we're going with this. New Testament, written 50, 100 AD. Earliest copy we're going to be talking about 130, 150 AD, less than 100 years time span between the original autographs written New Testament time, the apostles, inspired men, and the copy that we have of their writings. And we have over 5,600 manuscripts that we can compare then and make certain the writing is correct, and also have more to say on the fact that those that are honest about it give that a 99.5% rating of accuracy on things. Yes, Cal.
There's one other writer I'd like to see on your list, Josephus.
Josephus, and that'd be a good one. I don't have it on the list. I got a
His
dozen
writings-
more, but that's a good
His
one.
writings around AD
That's right.
75,
Yeah.
maybe shortly thereafter, when he writes his histories, and everybody quotes him
That's
as
right.
factual, textual, and everything else. I'd love to see the same statistics on
Yeah,
Josephus.
he could be put up there. I've got another dozen here that I'm not aware of, and you may be aware of some of these. Demosthenes,
Yeah.
Herodias, I can't even pronounce, Libby, several of these other names here on things. Just making the point, there's a whole host more on things. So if you're talking to somebody, they don't know any of these people, I might bring in some other, but Josephus is another good example. Another good example.
He'd be contemporary with the biblical writings,
That's right.
and it'd be interesting just to compare his.
Right. That would be. Pat, question or comment?
The ones that you put up there, people that are not big Bible believers would know these people more than they would know
I think, yeah.
Josephus.
Yeah, I think so too on things, especially on this. Why I don't see him on any of the list, Josephus, that I looked at on things, but it could well be put up there for sure on things. Could well be on things. But you see the point that we're making here. New Testament documents are better preserved and more numerous than any other ancient writings on things. And this is the evidence that we ask Bible critics to look at and honestly consider these type of evidences with this comparison with the other noted ancient writings. You can see there's thousands more New Testament Greek manuscripts than any other ancient writing.
Josephus was generally
I'm
considered
sorry?
as a contemporary historian. He was writing about Christ.
Josephus was, that's right. Yeah, he lived in the time of the apostles and the time of Christ, so he was contemporary. And now, he, like any other historian, they embellish things on things, and you have to separate some of that, especially when talk about numbers and things of that nature. Historians do that. Historians today do that, embellish some things. And it takes people comparing what he says with actual facts of history and other documents to tell which ones are actual fact or not. But he is still a credible historian for that day and age. But as I made mention, the internal consistency of New Testament documents, according to those that study this, give it a 99.5% rating of being textually pure. It's amazing accuracy when you compare it with all of these other ancient writings, is the point. It's just phenomenal whenever you compare it. There's no others that give that kind of a rating to the others, but yet they still accept them. I don't know how many of you heard of John Warwick Montgomery. John Warwick Montgomery, born in early 1930s. He's still alive, the best I can tell. Lives in France. A noted lawyer, professor, theologian, writer, lecturer, debater. Everybody in here is probably old enough to remember Madalyn Murray O'Hair before she passed away. Noted atheist. This fellow debated her. Public debate. Broadcast in 1976 on things. This was the noted individual to take on a debate with Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Joseph Fletcher, everybody know who Joseph Fletcher is? He's the author of Situation Ethics. This fellow debated Joseph Fletcher back at that time also. Situation Ethics had been the big things in my growing up years on things on it. But he debated Joseph Fletcher. And that's just a handful of the people that he's noted of debating with respect to Christian apologetics. He's noted in England especially, in the United States too. A lot of these debates took place in the United States, exceptionally knowledgeable in this field. And just giving the background who he is, to tell you what he says, to be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. And that's assessment of his studies, I realize, and that's man's studies on things, but you're going to find that in any of these people who have studied this honestly, comparing it with the other writings, ancient writings, and the writing of the New Testament, writings that we don't have original autographs for, with respect to the same thing New Testament don't have original autographs for. But the point we're trying to make is it's not a problem, or shouldn't be a problem in people's minds on things. God chose to preserve His Word through copies. Didn't need the original autographs because there's so much evidence out there that the preservation has taken place to a 99.5% accuracy rating just by virtue of the copies. And now you don't have anything out there that somebody could worship, like an autograph of the New Testament books. Now, to add to this, in addition to these some 5,600 manuscripts that are in Greek, there are over 19,000 copies in the Syriac, Latin, Coptic, Egyptian, Aramaic languages. So the total supporting New Testament manuscript base is over 24,000. And that's why we're saying that the reliability of the New Testament integrity of Scriptures rests primarily on the overwhelming number of manuscripts that have been and still are being compared one with another to make certain we have an accurate rendition of the New Testament will of God. That is just overwhelming, and this is the basis then of evidence that we're talking about here. Questions or comments on what we've said here so far? Manuscript evidence. Another important aspect of this discussion is the fact that we have a fragment of the Gospel of John that dates back to around 29 years from the original writing. This is the John Rylands Papyri that's dated around 125 A.D. This is extremely close to the original writing date. Simply unheard of in any other ancient writing to have a copy that's close to the autograph of whatever that is a copy of. It just demonstrates also the Gospel of John's a first century document. And what I have here next, I don't have it on your outline, but a list of just three here, what we're talking about. Some of the oldest existing New Testament manuscripts compared to when they were originally penned. Yes, John?
How they date that?
How they date it? They date it by the material it's written on, the style of writing, a whole host of other things, comparing it to other writings that are out there, where it was found archaeologically on things. Now, you have to admit, if you're discussing with somebody that's an avid critic of the Bible, that dating methods aren't totally accurate on things. And we're putting our hands basically in studies like this, those that are more knowledgeable in the dating method than what we would be on things. But there's a whole host of bibliographers that have studied out, and they believe that this was written at 125 A.D. with a comparison of all of the things that are out there. I've got a quotation here. Get to it more fully in a bit. There's a fellow, a German theologian, lived in 1866 to 1937, Desmond. He was convinced that this was written well within the reign of Hadrian, the Roman emperor, 117 to 138 A.D., and perhaps even during the time of Trajan, which is 98 to 117 AD on things. He, among many, many others, studied it, in other words, all I'm saying on things, and that's their assessment based upon everything they know about writing in that age and what was going on in that age.
How do they know it wasn't wrote 30 years earlier by John?
Well,
That's what I was getting at.
yeah, I see what you're
30
saying.
years, that's,
Yeah,
you
right.
ain't changed technology that much back.
Yeah, and I don't know how they determined that it's not an original. I can't answer that question on things, but it must be, again, based upon the evidence they see in the document, somehow or another, on it, that they think it couldn't have been written by his own hand in some way or another.
You have different names there. John Rylands. Who is John Rylands?
John Rylands, he is an English entrepreneur, philanthropist. He lived in 1801 to 1888. He was one of the foremost millionaires of that day and age on things. And like other philanthropists, they just like collecting things. He made his money in textile manufacture. And he didn't have any, as far as I can tell, by looking at his background, any background in theology, just an interest in ancient artifacts. And he is the one that purchased this years and years ago, is what I can find out at least. In fact, John Rylands, his wife, built him a library. It's in Manchester, England. That's where this particular fragment is located, Manchester, England. There's a John Rylands library. You can look on Wikipedia and bring a picture of it on things, and has all kinds of artifacts, ancient artifacts, not related to the Bible even, but he just avid collector and spending his money on things like this. And so it's called the John Rylands fragment because that's where it's at, and he was the one that purchased it some years ago. Yes.
Well, just on these things, they're all collected by different people
Yeah.
for different reasons, but they all require provenance. They all have to know how it was collected, and somebody could lie to them, but they would investigate it very thoroughly on when it was discovered, what were the conditions, everything about it helps them come up with a probable date. Now we know that they date things, rocks, by the type of artifacts that are found in them, and the types of artifacts are dated by the types of rocks that are found. So that's kind of a circular reason. But I think on more modern things that we're discovering here, that let's say within the last 3,000 years, there are different ways to date things within a reasonable accuracy. I don't know that 29 years will be exactly correct, but it's probable. But it's fairly close. Just from the dating process, the way they go through the date things, figure out when it happened. A lot of times we have in America, they're finding Indian sites now that they say date 1,300 years ago, or sometimes they'll say it might be 5,000 or 6,000 years. I said, okay, we kind of take a look at that,
Yeah, that's right.
take it with a grain of salt, whatever. But when you start dating a whole lot of things that are also found in the same area at the same time, then it becomes part of a group of things that were discovered in the same area at the same time from the same period of time. And then it
Like
becomes
the
easier.
Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, is one
Yes.
example of a site on things. Where they found that everything there they had already dated at a certain time, and the documents appear to be dated the same type of frame. I mean, those things are all factors, but I can't tell you all the factors that are involved. But it'd be a good thing to individually study as far as that goes on it, to have a little more assurance of the date. But I would just acknowledge that the dates could be off. I mean, it can be off 100 years, but still it's just a marvelous thing that you have something that close compared to what we find in other documents that are out there as far as that goes on it. I made mention of the John Rylands fragment here. It contains, and it's just a fragment, it's just a piece, a sheet, contains John 18, 32 to 33, and 37, 38. They know there are more because it's just it's ripped off from the rest of the document there. But it is these passages that are found in the Gospel of John, and we would date the Gospel of John somewhere between 80 to 100 A.D. And if it is true that this fragment is worthy of the 125 AD date, and that's only 29 years apart. But another thing too, this is not the only one we have. We'll talk about more on things, but Chester Beatty is another one, dated at 200 AD, and it contains virtually all of Paul's epistles and also the book of Hebrews, most of the book of Hebrews. And we believe Paul's epistles were written around 50 to 70 AD, comparing the things that Paul talked about and other historical documents bearing about what was happening Roman Empire at that time. So you got a difference of about 150 years from the original writing to the date of that particular manuscript. Bodmer Papyrus, dated about 175 to 200 AD. It contains most of the Gospel of John. Again, Gospel of John, written, I believe, around 90 to 100 AD. So about 80 to 100 years difference of time between the copy and the time of the original writing. Chester Beatty manuscript, papyrus manuscript, is housed in the Chester Beatty Museum in Dublin, Ireland, and also in Ann Arbor, Michigan. University of Michigan Library has parts of this Chester Beatty papyrus. The Bodmer Papyrus, and we'll talk about this more too, looks like next week, it is in Barcelona and also in San Lucas and a couple of different, no, I skipped down to one place. Geneva, Switzerland is where it's located. And just relate that, just so you know that they are in existence, have been in existence now for several centuries, and they've been studied, and they're restudied all the time. Make sure this is the date. Somebody back there, 500 AD, said Chester Beatty was 200 AD. Well, let's look at it again. Let's see if that bears out. And they haven't disproved it yet. We'll see on things, and maybe Lynn again answered your question how they determined that. Somebody didn't study it 500 years ago and accept the evidence. Believe me, they're continuing to study to see whether or not these dates are accurate.
There are always going to be those that want to disprove it, and
That's
they will
right.
be studied.
Always going to be somebody out there who's wanting to try to disprove, especially dates like this. Now, again, all this is why we state the critics of the Bible dismiss the New Testament as reliable information. Then they must also, if they're honest, dismiss the reliability of the writings of Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, Homer, and like I said, there's a dozen more others, and you could add Josephus to that list also. On the other hand, though, if the critics acknowledge the historicity and writings of all those other ancient individuals, then they must, if they're going to be honest, retain the historicity and writings of the New Testament authors. The evidence for the New Testament's reliability is far greater than all of the others. And so this gives us the superior criteria here for affirming the New Testament documents than any other ancient writing that's out there. This is the evidence. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. There is credible evidence that supports our faith, our belief that what we have is an accurate reflection of the original writings of the apostles' inspired writers, just by virtue of the evidence of these copies. Time has gone. We've got more to study on this. We're going to look at these manuscripts individually here. Some of them that we know exist and what's in them next week, Lord willing. Next Lord's Day morning. Thank you for your attention here this morning.
I never had that. You're not gonna get up tomorrow.
Nobody would put in time was put in.
Not time to get up yet.
Yeah, I think he puts in like a few extra